September 17, 1944, Arnhem, Netherlands. Captain Roy Urquhart crouches inside a British Tetrarch light tank, listening to German 88mm anti-tank guns bracket his position with rounds that should turn his vehicle into shredded aluminum. The Tetrarch weighs 7.5 tons, uses armor plates so thin you can dent it with a hammer, and mounts a 2-pounder gun that German tankers call the door knocker because it bounces off their armor like someone politely asking to come in. Urquhart's tank is literally made from aluminum alloy and steel so thin that British tank crews nicknamed it the paper tank and the death trap on tracks. German intelligence reports describe Tetrarchs as reconnaissance vehicles unsuitable for combat, training tanks accidentally sent to the front, jokes on treads that any proper anti-tank weapon will punch through like wet cardboard. The 88mm gun currently firing at Urquhart can penetrate 165 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. His tank's frontal armor measures 16 millimeters. The math says he should already be dead, the tank a burning wreck, the crew scattered across the Dutch countryside. Instead, 3 direct hits from 88mm rounds have struck his Tetrarch in the last 2 minutes, and Urquhart is still alive, still fighting, still moving. In the next hour, his paper tank is going to survive 17 direct anti-tank hits, destroy 2 German positions, and prove that sometimes the worst armor in the war can be the best armor because physics doesn't always work the way engineers think it should. The Tetrarch light tank represented everything British armor design got wrong in the late 1930s. Conceived in 1937 as an airborne light tank that could be carried by gliders and dropped behind enemy lines, the Tetrarch prioritized weight reduction over protection, mobility over firepower, and deployability over survivability. The design constraints were brutal. The tank couldn't exceed 7.5 tons because that was the maximum weight the proposed Hamilton glider could carry. Every component was lightened, thinned, or eliminated to meet this requirement. The result was a vehicle so fragile that British Army evaluators initially rejected it as unsuitable for combat operations. The armor specification tells the complete story of the Tetrarch's inadequacy. Frontal armor, 16 millimeters, side armor, 14 millimeters, rear armor, 10 millimeters, top armor, 4 millimeters. For context, the German Panzer IV, a medium tank, had 80mm frontal armor. The Sherman, also a medium tank, had 51mm. Even the Stuart light tank, America's reconnaissance vehicle, had 44mm frontal armor. The Tetrarch's protection was closer to an armored car than a tank, and many armored cars had thicker plate. The 16mm frontal armor could be penetrated by heavy machine guns at close range, by any anti-tank rifle in service, and by every anti-tank gun ever manufactured. The 2-pounder main gun was obsolete by 1944 standards. Designed in the 1930s when tank armor was thinner, the 2-pounder fired a 40mm armor-piercing round that could penetrate maybe 50 millimeters of armor at point-blank range under ideal conditions. Against German tanks in 1944, it was effectively useless. The Panzer IV's frontal armor was impervious to 2-pounder fire beyond 100 meters. The Panther and Tiger tanks were completely immune at any range. Tetrarch crews joked that their main weapon was useful for annoying the enemy, not killing them, and that firing at German tanks mostly served to reveal your position so German gunners knew where to aim. The British Army had tried to cancel Tetrarch production in 1942, recognizing the design was fundamentally flawed for modern warfare. But 177 had already been built, and the vehicles were sitting in depots consuming storage space and maintenance resources. The solution was relegating Tetrarchs to training duties and home defense, keeping them in Britain where their inadequacy wouldn't get crews killed. This worked until someone realized that Operation Market Garden, the ambitious September 1944 airborne assault to capture bridges in the Netherlands, needed light armor support for the paratroopers who'd be landing behind German lines. The problem was that no other Allied tank could be delivered by glider. The Americans had the M22 Locust airborne tank, but it was still in development and wouldn't be available until 1945. The British had the Tetrarch, obsolete and inadequate, but available and technically capable of being carried by the Hamilton glider that had finally become operational in 1944. The decision came down to sending paratroopers into combat with no armor support, or sending them with terrible armor support. Terrible was better than nothing, so 8 Tetrarchs were assigned to the 6th Airborne Armored Reconnaissance Regiment for market garden operations. The crews selected to man these death traps understood exactly what they were being asked to do. Captain Roy Urquhart, commanding one of the Tetrarchs assigned to Arnhem, later wrote that the briefing officer apologized while explaining the mission. The officer acknowledged the Tetrarch was inadequate, that its armor wouldn't stop German anti-tank weapons, and that the 2-pounder gun couldn't destroy German tanks. But the presence of any tank, even a terrible one, would provide psychological support to paratroopers and might suppress German infantry positions. The unspoken message was clear: you're probably going to die, but maybe you'll be useful before that happens. The glider insertion on September 17, 1944 was itself a minor miracle. Getting a 7.5-ton tank into a glider, flying it across enemy territory, and landing it without breaking the vehicle or killing the crew tested the limits of what was technically possible. The Hamilton glider was a massive aircraft, 68 feet long with a 110-foot wingspan, designed specifically to carry vehicles. The Tetrarch fit barely, with inches of clearance on each side, and the combined weight of tank and glider pushed the limits of what the towing aircraft could handle. Urquhart's glider landed in a field northwest of Arnhem, hitting hard enough that the tank's suspension bottomed out and several track links broke. The crew spent 20 minutes making field repairs under sporadic small arms fire from German positions they couldn't see through the Dutch hedgerows. Once mobile, Urquhart's Tetrarch headed toward Arnhem to link up with the 1st Airborne Division, which was attempting to capture the bridge over the Rhine River and hold it until ground forces advancing from the south could relieve them. The tactical situation was catastrophic from the start. British intelligence had assured planners that Arnhem was lightly defended by second-rate German troops, mostly rear echelon units and convalescent soldiers. This was spectacularly wrong. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, elite units refitting after heavy fighting in Normandy, happened to be in the Arnhem area. When British paratroopers landed, they found themselves facing not demoralized garrison troops but experienced Waffen SS veterans with tanks, artillery, and no intention of surrendering a critical bridge. Urquhart's Tetrarch encountered the 1st German position at 1420 hours on September 17th, roughly 3 hours after landing. A German 88mm anti-tank gun, positioned in a tree line covering the road to Arnhem, opened fire at 800 meters. The 88mm was Germany's most effective anti-tank weapon, a dual-purpose gun that could destroy any Allied tank in service and engage aircraft. Against a Tetrarch, it was like using a sledgehammer to swat a fly, massive overkill but absolutely effective. The first round missed, detonating in the field beside Urquhart's tank. The second round hit the Tetrarch's frontal armor dead center, a perfect shot that should have penetrated, detonated inside the fighting compartment, and killed everyone instantly. Instead, something impossible happened. The 88mm round punched through the 16mm armor plate, creating a 40mm hole surrounded by petalled steel where the armor had been pushed outward by the projectile's passage. But the round didn't detonate inside the tank. It passed completely through the fighting compartment, missed every crew member by what the loader later described as maybe 6 inches, exited through the rear armor, and detonated 30 meters behind the tank. Urquhart's crew sat in shock silence for maybe 2 seconds, processing the fact that they were alive and the tank was still mobile. The gunner, Trooper James Davidson, said what everyone was thinking: "That should have killed us." Urquhart's response was pragmatic. "Drive forward, we're harder to hit if we're moving." The driver, Trooper William Hughes, accelerated toward the German position, and the loader, Trooper Peter Mills, chambered another 2-pounder round, even though everyone knew it was useless against the 88mm gun's armor shield. The third 88mm round hit the Tetrarch's turret side, penetrating the 14mm armor and passing through the turret ring before exiting through the opposite side. Again, the round didn't detonate inside the tank. It passed through empty space between the gun breech and the turret wall, missed the commander and gunner, and exited cleanly. The Tetrarch kept moving. The German gun crew, visible now at 400 meters, was frantically reloading, and Urquhart could see them pointing at his tank in apparent confusion about why it was still advancing. The fourth hit struck the hull side at an angle, penetrated and exited through the top armor, punching a hole in the 4mm roof plate. The fifth hit entered through the front, passed between the driver and the hull gunner, and exited through the engine deck. The sixth penetrated the turret rear and exited through the front. By this point, Urquhart's Tetrarch looked like it had been attacked with a hole punch, multiple entry and exit wounds, but still moving, still fighting. The physics of what was happening contradicted everything armor theory predicted. When an anti-tank round hits armor, it should either penetrate and detonate inside the target, or fail to penetrate and detonate outside. What shouldn't happen is the round penetrating cleanly without detonating, which is exactly what was occurring repeatedly. The explanation lay in how German 88mm anti-tank rounds were fused. The armor-piercing rounds used a base-detonating fuse designed to trigger after penetrating armor, ensuring the explosive charge detonated inside the target for maximum damage. The fuse was calibrated for penetrating thick armor, expecting resistance that would arm the fuse mechanism as the round forced its way through steel. The Tetrarch's armor was so thin that 88mm rounds passed through without encountering enough resistance to arm the fuses properly. The rounds were penetrating so easily, punching through 16mm of aluminum alloy and thin steel, that the fuse mechanism didn't register it as a proper penetration. The result was rounds passing completely through the tank, exiting the far side and only detonating after traveling several meters beyond the target where the backup timer fuse activated. It was like shooting through paper with a bullet designed to explode inside concrete. The lack of resistance meant the weapon's mechanism never activated. Urquhart didn't understand the physics in the moment. He just knew that German rounds were hitting his tank and he wasn't dead yet, which meant he could keep fighting. At 200 meters from the German 88mm position, close enough to see the gun crew's faces, Davidson fired the Tetrarch's 2-pounder. The round hit the 88mm gun's armor shield, ricocheted, and did no damage. Urquhart ordered Davidson to fire again, aiming for the gun crew rather than the gun itself. The second 2-pounder round hit one of the German loaders, and suddenly the 88mm crew was abandoning their position, running toward a fallback position in the woods. The Tetrarch had survived 7 direct hits from Germany's most powerful anti-tank gun and forced the gun crew to retreat. It made no sense. Every principle of armored warfare said thin armor meant death, that you couldn't survive hits from weapons capable of destroying tanks 4 times as heavy. But Urquhart was alive, his crew was alive, and the tank was mobile despite looking like Swiss cheese. The engagement spread through British communications with remarkable speed. Other Tetrarch crews heard that Urquhart had been hit repeatedly and survived. German radio intercepts captured confused reports from Wehrmacht units describing British tanks that wouldn't die despite being hit by 88mm guns. The German assessment was that the British had deployed some new armor technology, possibly reactive armor or special hardened steel. The reality that the armor was so thin it defeated the weapon by not being thick enough to trigger fuses apparently never occurred to German intelligence. Urquhart's Tetrarch continued operating throughout September 17th and 18th, supporting British paratroopers holding positions around Arnhem. The tank collected more hits, a Panzerfaust rocket that penetrated the side armor and passed through without detonating, several 37mm anti-tank gun rounds that penetrated and exited cleanly, and machine gun fire that actually did more cumulative damage than the anti-tank weapons because machine gun rounds detonated on impact with the thin armor rather than passing through. By the evening of September 18th, Urquhart's Tetrarch had 17 documented penetrations from various German anti-tank weapons. The armor was riddled with holes. The crew had improvised patches using tarps and metal salvaged from destroyed vehicles, not to restore armor protection but simply to keep rain out. The tank looked like a homeless person's shelter cobbled together from scrap, barely recognizable as a military vehicle. But it was still mobile, the gun still functioned, and the crew was uninjured except for minor cuts from flying fragments. The psychological effect on both sides was profound. British paratroopers saw the Tetrarch surviving hits that would destroy a Sherman and concluded it was somehow tougher than it looked. German infantry became wary of engaging the unkillable British tank that absorbed anti-tank fire and kept operating. Neither side understood the actual mechanism, the weird interaction between thin armor and over-engineered fuses, but both sides developed mythology around the Tetrarch's apparent invincibility. The other 7 Tetrarchs assigned to Arnhem had varied experiences. 2 were destroyed by German tanks in close-range engagements where the Panzerfe's 75mm guns managed to score penetrating hits that did detonate properly. 3 were disabled by mechanical failures, the Tetrarch's notoriously unreliable transmission and suspension giving out under combat stress. 1 was captured intact when its crew was killed by small arms fire while dismounted. Only Urquhart's Tetrarch, the most heavily damaged by anti-tank fire, remained operational through the entire Arnhem operation. The broader Market Garden operation failed catastrophically. British forces couldn't capture and hold the Arnhem Bridge against sustained SS Panzer Division counterattacks. The ground relief force advancing from the south couldn't break through German defenses to reach the paratroopers. By September 25th, the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division were ordered to withdraw across the Rhine, abandoning Arnhem and leaving behind thousands of casualties and prisoners. Urquhart's Tetrarch was scuttled before the withdrawal, its engine disabled and the main gun spiked to prevent German use. The crew escaped across the Rhine with other survivors, exhausted and traumatized, but alive. Urquhart's official after-action report carefully documented the 17 anti-tank hits, the circumstances of each penetration, and his assessment that the Tetrarch's thin armor had paradoxically provided better protection than thicker armor would have. His conclusion was cautious. The phenomenon seemed real but was probably specific to certain German anti-tank rounds and shouldn't be relied upon tactically. British ordnance officers read Urquhart's report with fascination and skepticism. The idea that thin armor could defeat anti-tank rounds by being too thin contradicted fundamental principles of armor design. They ordered tests using captured German 88mm guns firing at mock-ups of Tetrarch armor thickness. The test confirmed Urquhart's observations. 88mm armor-piercing rounds with base-detonating fuses frequently pass through very thin armor without detonating, while the same rounds reliably detonated when fired against medium-thickness armor. The physics explanation satisfied engineers but created a strategic dilemma. If thin armor sometimes provided better protection than medium armor, should British tank design incorporate this principle? The answer was complicated and ultimately negative. The phenomenon only worked against specific weapons with specific fuses under specific conditions. Against other weapons, thin armor was exactly as bad as expected. High explosive rounds, for example, detonated perfectly well against thin armor. Weapons with impact fuses rather than base-detonating fuses had no trouble destroying lightly armored vehicles. The Tetrarch's survival was a quirk of physics meeting German ammunition design, not a replicable principle for future armor. Moreover, relying on thin armor surviving by not triggering fuses was tactically insane. It meant accepting penetrations and hoping the rounds passed through empty space rather than hitting crew members or critical components. Urquhart's crew had survived 17 penetrations partly because several rounds passed through the tank in areas where no crew members happened to be sitting. That was luck, not design, and luck runs out. The Tetrarch's operational career ended with Market Garden. The surviving vehicles were withdrawn from combat service and relegated to training duties where their inadequacy wouldn't kill anyone. British airborne forces received no replacement light tanks until 1945, when American M22 Locusts finally became available. The Locust wasn't much better than the Tetrarch, slightly heavier and better armed, but still fundamentally inadequate. But at least it didn't have the Tetrarch's reputation as a death trap. The German crews who'd fired at Urquhart's Tetrarch and watched their rounds punch through without destroying the target never received an explanation for what had happened. Post-war interrogations of German tank crews and anti-tank gunners revealed that the Arnhem engagement with unkillable British light tanks had become something of a legend, a story traded between units about British super armor that defeated 88mm guns. Several prisoners asked their interrogators about the secret armor technology, genuinely curious about how the British had achieved such protection. The interrogators, armed with Urquhart's report and the ordnance testing results, explained the actual mechanism. The armor was so thin it didn't properly trigger German fuses. The prisoners' reactions ranged from disbelief to frustration. One former 88mm gunner reportedly said, "You're telling me we built our fuses too well and they didn't work because the British armor was too weak? That's the most German problem I've ever heard." The broader lesson about armor design influenced post-war tank development in subtle ways. Designers recognized that fuse technology mattered as much as armor thickness, that weapons and armor existed in a constant evolutionary race where each development created new vulnerabilities. The shape-charge warhead, which became standard for anti-tank weapons after World War II, largely eliminated the thin armor paradox because shaped charges don't rely on fuse timing. They detonate on impact and project a jet of superheated metal through the armor regardless of thickness. Modern tank armor is composite, layered materials designed to defeat specific weapons through various mechanisms. Some layers are ceramic that shatters projectiles, some are reactive armor that explodes outward to disrupt incoming rounds, and some are traditional steel plate. The design philosophy acknowledges that no single armor solution works against all threats. That protection comes from understanding how weapons work and engineering countermeasures. That's the principle Urquhart inadvertently demonstrated. Sometimes the best defense comes from understanding your enemy's weapons well enough to exploit their weaknesses, even when that exploitation is accidental. Urquhart survived the war, promoted to major and awarded the Military Cross for actions at Arnhem. His citation mentioned exceptional courage and leadership under fire, but didn't specifically reference the 17 anti-tank hits or the paper tank that wouldn't die. He returned to civilian life as an engineer, working for an automotive company designing suspension systems. When interviewed by military historians in the 1970s, he downplayed the Tetrarch survival story, emphasizing that luck had played a larger role than anything else. His assessment was probably accurate. The Tetrarch's thin armor defeating German fuses was a fortunate accident, not a replicable tactic. Other Tetrarchs at Arnhem had been destroyed by the same weapons that failed to kill Urquhart's tank, proving the phenomenon wasn't reliable. But the engagement demonstrated something valuable about warfare. Sometimes inadequate equipment in the right circumstances can perform better than superior equipment, not because of design, but because complex systems like weapons and armor interact in unpredictable ways when pushed to extremes. The Tetrarch light tank entered service as a bad idea, operated throughout its career as an acknowledged failure, and ended its combat history having accidentally discovered that its worst characteristic, laughably thin armor, could paradoxically provide protection under specific circumstances that nobody had predicted and nobody could have designed for intentionally. It was warfare at its most chaotic and unpredictable, where physics and engineering and pure dumb luck combined to produce outcomes that made no sense until you understood exactly how every system involved actually worked. German crews had laughed at the paper tank, mocked it as a training vehicle, dismissed it as irrelevant. Then they'd hit it 17 times with weapons that should have vaporized it and watched it keep fighting. The laughter stopped not because the Tetrarch became a good tank, it remained objectively terrible, but because sometimes in war, terrible equipment survives when good equipment fails, for reasons that make perfect sense only in retrospect, and only if you understand that weapons are designed to defeat expected threats, not unexpected thin armor that accidentally exploits their fusing mechanisms. The last surviving Tetrarch sits in the Bovington Tank Museum in Britain, restored to pristine condition, its armor intact and unpunctured. It's beautiful in the way museum pieces are, clean and complete and fundamentally dishonest about what combat actually looked like. Urquhart's Tetrarch, the one that survived 17 hits, was scuttled in a Dutch field and never recovered. It's probably still there, buried in the mud near Arnhem, a paper tank that refused to die, riddled with holes but somehow more durable than tanks 4 times as heavy, proof that sometimes the worst armor in the war could be the best armor, not through engineering but through accident. So the next time someone tells you that you're too weak, too fragile, or too inadequate to survive, remember Captain Roy Urquhart and his paper tank Tetrarch. Sometimes your greatest weakness can accidentally become your greatest strength, and sometimes the armor that should kill you is exactly what keeps you alive. If you enjoyed watching a tank made of aluminum foil survive 17 direct hits from Germany's most powerful anti-tank gun, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories of death traps, rejected designs, and completely inadequate machines that somehow survived when the best equipment failed. Now here's your challenge for the comments. If you could exploit any weakness as a strength in modern warfare, what would it be? Would you make a stealth fighter out of cardboard because radar is calibrated for metal? Build a warship so slow that torpedoes' proximity fuses think it's a stationary island? Design body armor so thin that bullets pass straight through without transferring energy? Give me your most creative, most absurd, or most brilliantly backwards engineering solution. Bonus points. If you can explain the actual physics of why your weakness as strength strategy would work. Drop your answers below, and may the most paradoxical yet somehow logical response win bragging rights. Thanks for watching, and remember, it's not about the thickness of your armor, it's about understanding your enemy's weapons well enough to accidentally exploit their design flaws while getting shot at 17 times.